Alright, so in this first video, we're going to model and rig the character, and I'm going to put myself down here in the corner just to annoy some people that are wondering why you even in screen, couldn't you just speak to this, or couldn't you, maybe you should just be quiet, I don't know. But I'm putting myself down here in the corner. I'm going to be looking at this video that I recorded earlier, and I'm just going to speak to it. And if you have seen me model before, I've got about 69 episodes worth of 10-minute modeling challenge, so you pretty much know the routine by now, and if you haven't caught those videos, you should really go and check them out. Because that'll give me a few views as well. But not only that, I think even though they're not meant to be tutorials, they show pretty much the entire workflow of how to create, especially I've done a lot of videos on low poly characters. So I've pretty much, I don't know if I've nailed the method, but I've found a method that I'm happy with anyway. And that's pretty much the same method that I follow here. So I'm not going to go into talking as if this was a tutorial, but you've got the screencast keys there that'll show you, and this is in real time. So you should be able to follow along and do the same type of operations that I'm doing here. And I've used the auto mirror, and that's an add-on that comes with Blender by default. So, but you just have to go in and enable it. And I struggled, I didn't struggle, but I fought enabling that. And I always did it the manual method. But I really advise or suggest that you'd go into preferences, add-ons, and then just enable auto mirror because it makes it a lot easier. You don't have to cut away the center face and stuff. And then it's a matter of a lot of E to extrude and S to scale. And I always start with the torso and then I extrude the character downwards and create, this one ended up getting skinny legs, like a skinny cowboy. I believe skinny jeans are on the way out, aren't they? So my kids told me, so I guess I have to change. It took me a long time to even get used to those, but I put them on in the end and nearly didn't get them off because they were so skinny. And for being a tall and long Swedish guy, it looked like a stick figure. But maybe that's why I got the inspiration for this character. There are pros and cons to go in, both with the skinny figures. It's a little bit easier to animate because you don't really risk intersecting polygons so much. And so that's one of the benefits, but I don't think it's too much of a problem if they do overlap. I can itch myself because I'm just down here in the corner now, so. I also go for, usually for low poly characters, I don't really model individual fingers. So I stick to just doing a palm usually and a thumb. That's about as far as I go. And I'm sorry if you don't like country music and blues and like American rock and stuff like that, you're gonna have to put either me and the music on mute. So I've got a lot of tracks from Epidemic Sound. I need to keep it to theme. So you can't really see that it's a cowboy yet, but we have to get in the mood, I think. As you can see, I've put some geometry by the elbow. Even though it's pretty much a straight line there, then it's important that the elbow actually has a few extra lines around it. So when you bend the elbow like this, it has got some geometry so it doesn't just fold. If you have just a single loop cut there, or even none, you can't really fold that arm at all. Another thing I do for the character is this. I usually try to mimic the shape of a human body or something, as if the spine is bending a little bit like an S. So even for low poly characters, I do a little bit of that. And I usually do the head last. So I extrude a neck from the top of the head, and then usually I extrude like a block square type of head. Low poly heads are, I think, one of the more difficult things to do. And I tend to not model anything apart from the eyes. I've tried usually with a nose and a mouth, but I tend to like the versions where I just do eyes. And also for games, it's common that maybe you'll keep the characters quite small if you're making a platformer or something, so you get away with that. But I guess there's no stopping you if you want to add a lot more features like a mouth and a nose and stuff. Facial hair I usually put on as well, like a mustache or a beard. That looks pretty cool, low poly. And lately I've gone for this type of a face shape as well, as if you've got like the cheeks here coming out and going down. So instead of the substitute for the nose, it's basically like a jaw popping out like that, more or less. A good thing with this now is I don't have to worry too much about the editing part, since I'm going to free flow this whole video. So I'm going to be able to have a sip of coffee. I suggest that you pause this and go and grab yourself something to drink as well if you haven't, because this is going to be a long one. And this is just the first out of 5, so you're going to be in for a long one here. And Most of the time when I model characters, I model them with the clothes on, but in this one we're going to do a little bit different. I'll do clothes on this one first of all, but in the second video I'm going to be modeling, I found a way to model clothes so that the weight paint sticks pretty good to it and that the polygons won't really penetrate so much through. That's usually a problem if you try to model clothes after you've done the character. Usually that's a real pain because as you try to weight paint it similar to the character, it's pretty much impossible to do manually. But if you extrude the body into new clothing, as we'll do in part 2, you'll find that the weight painting is going to be really, really good. So usually it doesn't penetrate. And another method to do the clothes later on when we get to that would be to actually replace the whole upper body for like a top body without separate clothes. You can do that as well, and I think that's quite common to do in games. When I researched a little bit in the past, usually you swap the whole upper body, but we're actually going to do separate type of clothing here. So at this point, we're a few minutes in, and usually I just model the whole character and put a solid color on it, like a skin tone type. And then I usually just shift select. I go into working everything here in face mode most of the time. And then I block select a whole bunch of faces and I colorize them. And if you're interested how to colorize like I'm doing here, I suggest that you go and check out my Learn Low Poly Modeling in Blender video. That's a quite lengthy one, but it covers all the operations that I'm doing now, or actions to do the modeling, but it also has this way to colorize the mesh using a palette PNG. I'm just using like a gradient PNG file. And if you expand the description of this video, you can download this and use this palette freely as well if you want. So instead of doing the traditional UV unwrapping and then painting textures, I'm basically just UV unwrapping it, but like one square face, for example, like on the side of his body or something, or in fact, straight in the middle of his face. I basically shrink that polygon down to infinitely small, and then I move on the left side there where you can see the UV layout, I just move that what looks like a little pixel. I'll move it to a designated color, and that's what that color will end up with. And it's a really efficient way to colorize characters. And another thing that I like about this is when you model a character like this or any object, you can basically zoom in infinitely and you won't really lose any quality because the geometry, the GPU will render those faces and have really nice, pure, solid, straight line cuts between the two colors, no matter how close you go. Sometimes when you do, I mean, you can get away with it a little bit if you have closest instead of interpolated colors in the UV maps or textures. You can get a similar effect, but usually it's quite tricky to get a line drawn onto a texture that's like especially diagonal ones that don't get blurry if you zoom in close. It's a bit ironic that I say this because usually I create my characters to be viewed from a distance anyway. But what I'm trying to say is that this method of colorizing is pretty useful, pretty good, and quick, easy, good quality, and a lot of pros there, not a lot of cons, unless you're making a convict. See that I forgot to color the underneath. It looks like he's got a no pants under in the crotch area there, but I think I come back to that one and colorize this in a moment. And then I add boots, and at this point I'm actually making it into the character, so I haven't separated these into separate boots at the moment. And this is my usual way of doing characters if I don't plan to have them be able to change their clothes. This is usually how I go through with it the whole time. This was an attempt to make cowboy boots, but usually I don't really work with a reference, which you probably should do, so it doesn't look like cowboy boots, but that's another beautiful thing with low poly. You get away with a lot of stuff, I think. And then I extrude here in the center of his body. I do a belt here because we need to have like a revolver on this guy, don't we? So I should sell the idea of low poly to you, why you should be doing low poly. Maybe this is a good opportunity to do that while we're modeling this character. And there's plenty of reasons why I think low poly is superb, amazing, great, all those things. And first of all, they're quite easy to make. So if you want to start learn how to model, I think a low poly character is a really good way to get it going. It's very easy when you start to model a detailed character that you get stuck on details or carried away, and you'll get yourself into a corner where you can't really get yourself out of it, and you feel after a few hours like, oh, this is a pain. I've spent all this time on just modeling like his shoulder, and it's too detailed, it's too problematic. So I'd suggest that you do a lot of low poly characters first, because the workflow is going to be quite good in the future. If you do a low poly character, then you can always subdivide it and add detail to them in the future. And if you stick to a decent quad topology, where you try to keep as many quad faces as possible and avoid triangles or n-gons. N-gons are where you have loads of points, more than 4 at least, so 5, 6, 7, 8 sides to a polygon. So if you avoid those, stick to quads, like this character is pretty much all quads, then you can do a subdivide modifier if you want to go high poly at some point and add detail. And then you could even bring in to do like a sculpt detail for future clothing and stuff. So one of the parts then, a part which is good with low poly, is that it's simple to get started, and with that comes as well that you can do a lot of characters. And before I continue, I should actually mention that I wreck his hand here. I forgot to enable see-through or X-ray, and I didn't spot it here when I was modeling, but his hand is all destroyed now and distorted because I only moved the front few vertices. And that happens as well a lot when you model characters, and you shouldn't really fear it too much, because by the time I spot this later on, it's quite easy. Again, it's low poly, so I just end up deleting the hand in a little while and recreate it. So it's a bit easy to forget that sometimes when you model. You look at another part of the body and you might end up wrecking some geometry on the side, but not to worry, you can always fix it. It's quite easy. You'll do a lot of mistakes as well, especially if you're getting started, or I've been doing characters now for a very long time, or different objects in Blender, and I save often, and don't be afraid to go back and delete and start over if you need to do it. Usually the second time around you'll do a better job. I used to think that if I wreck something, I always used to feel quite frustrated and think I can never do it that good again. But I found that the opposite is pretty much true. When you've done it a few times, usually if you do it again and again and again, it's actually going to turn out better in the future. So it's quite amazing that I didn't spot this totally distorted hand here. But I guess I was really focused on doing the head. So if you just ignore that until we fix the hand, you should be all right too, I think, if you even can now that I've pointed it out. For eyes on characters, I usually go low poly like this, and I create a separate geometry for the eye. I don't really want to subdivide the head too much to create all those extra subdivisions that would be required to get a proper eye in there. So I do usually Shift D to duplicate one of the forehead faces there. And then I shrink it down and extrude it into an eye like I did for this one. And same thing I do for the beard here and the hair. I usually select a bunch of just faces onto the head here, and then either Shift D to duplicate it and Alt D to extrude that out into facial hair. And again, if you want to learn this, check out all my videos on the low poly characters, especially in the 10-minute modeling challenge, because in 10 minutes you can do a full character, and even with a little bit of practice, if you're new, if you repeat it enough and do different type of characters, and check out those episodes. I do 5 characters in 10 minutes in one of the videos. In another one I do 3 Santas. In another one I do a fully rigged pirate with a face in 10 minutes. I've got some other ones as well where I do like a game character, and just a few episodes ago I did where you have 3 different clothes-styled characters as well. So I started to be a bit more liberal, as it called, on the timing. I used to be super strict with the 10 minutes, and I still consider it a fail if I don't finish in 10 minutes, but in the bonus material I usually add quite a lot of extra time, so I think it's more important to show and teach and be able to see rather than sticking to the time limit 100%. Oh yeah, I was meant to sell in the concept why you should be doing low poly a lot more as well. So like I said, first of all, fast to make and easy to learn. And another good thing is that it'll enable people that don't really traditionally do modeling. You'll be able to do characters for your own games. So if you're a developer, I've had quite a lot of comments from developers saying that, thank you, finally, I don't have to have that cylinder in my game. I can actually start modeling my own characters. So it's a lot of fun to hear that. And I think it's perfect to start with low poly then, because as a developer, you can just jump into Blender. It's free after all. And then follow these type of routines, these type of tutorials, and then do yourself a favor and start to model a few characters so you don't have to look at those primitive cubes and capsules in your games. So easy to learn, I think, to do low poly. So let's just continue selling in the concept of low poly. It's also a pretty cool art style, I think. It's got its distinct personal look, and if you're as old as me or even older or younger, then pixel art might be a thing that you like, and I think that low poly is pretty much like the equivalent of pixel art, but in 3D instead of 2D. So it's got those crispy clean colors and like a really distinct style that looks a bit retro gamey. So the art style itself is really good for games, I think, especially for indie games. Oh yeah, one more thing then is performance. That's really good. If you're making a mobile game, you can't really get much more performance than going low poly. So you'll get a lot of characters that you could do, and if you have animated characters if you import them into Unity, that's mainly the engine that I use, but the same is true for pretty much all game engines, if it's Unreal Engine or probably Godot and everything. So the more polygons that you have, and the more armature bones that you have, we'll get into armature in a little bit. So the more bones you have and the more polygons, the harder the graphics card will have to work, and the CPU for that matter, when you animate the character and you bend all these bones, because it has to calculate everything about how to rotate all the vertices, and how to warp all the polygons to make it into the animated character. So the more polygons you have and the more detail, the more you'll struggle with that. And if you're only using one character on the screen, that's usually not really a problem. If you're using 5, that's not usually a problem either. But if you're getting into quite a few characters, so we're making a real-time strategy game now where, in particular, we've got a lot of infantry units, and if you have maybe even like 1,000 of those on the screen at the same time, even if they're low poly, the computer will start to struggle quite a lot. So then you have to look into alternative methods to optimize that. And I shouldn't be going into detail for that, but there's stuff like imposter, there's something called, where you render basically like sprite counterparts of the low poly characters, or the characters in whether it's low poly or not. And you can also do other neat tricks to up the performance. So maybe a future video I can go into things like that, how to optimize it. But the point is then anyway that low poly will be able to get you more characters on the screen and get the power left over to do other stuff for your game, and maybe you don't have to spend quite as much time optimizing your game if you're going low poly, because even if you don't optimize it too much, it'll be fast enough. So performance, big thing. Keep that in mind. And with performance also comes real-time shadows is often used in games these days. So when you do real-time shadows, the computer will have to, or it's the graphics card that does all this, and it's really performant these days. But the more polygons that you have, the graphics card will have to calculate where the light is coming from, and then take all the geometry and convert those into shapes that it'll cast onto maybe the ground or any other characters or objects. So naturally, the more polygons that you have on the characters and in your world, the more it'll be taxing on the computer to do those type of operations. And there are ways for high poly characters to compensate for that. You can do like a low poly shadow caster, for example. But the beauty is now that you can just use the same rendering and shadow casting character without any problems. So another good thing for low poly here. So I hope you like the music, by the way. This is from, I'm not sponsored by Epidemic Sound. In fact, I pay those to get a monthly subscription so I can put this music. I compose my own music, but I don't really do any Western inspired. But if this turns into a game, I'm going to be making some own Western style music. I like the vibes. My wife hates the fact that I like old Western style music. If I put on American Remains by what's it called, the highwayman in the car, she basically drops herself to the floor in the car. She doesn't want to be seen and she's embarrassed, but I like it. Isn't it amazing that I haven't spotted the broken hand yet? It's I must be so focused on modeling this. Now it's like the necktie, the cowboy necktie that I'm modeling, and it's beyond me how I've managed to keep that hand broken for so long. Put in the comments if you think that I should speak more about the actual modeling, but like I said, for the actual modeling process, I've got so many videos. If you check my channel history on how to model these characters, basically I say every operation: extrude here, extract there, scale there. There's no such thing as extract, but extrude and scale, that's pretty much the only operations that you really need to know. So I thought I'd take the opportunity in this video just to speak a little bit more about the process around it, and just things to maybe that are good to know, and you can check those other videos for the actual modeling part. And maybe for the animation video where I do keyframing, where I haven't done so many videos about, for those I could probably speak a little bit more about exactly how I'm doing things, and that video is going to be so long anyways. And here's where I'm modeling this. I still didn't have in mind to do separate clothing because like I said, I usually have the character with fixed clothes. I've always wanted to do separate clothing, so you can basically have like a character creator part of your game where you can change your clothing. But it's always been a problem because I've always tried to model the clothes afterwards and separately. And it was more or less by accident that I came across this method that I'll be using in this one, since I start with just taking a few of the polygons later on when I've mapped this character. So, but a lot more of that one is going to be in the video too, so maybe I shouldn't talk about that too much in this video. Another good thing with low poly is that you can use it as a base for a future high poly, and I sort of touched on that one before. And when you're making a game character, often the game itself would have the low poly character, but you model a high poly character that you bake textures with. So if you want to have ambient occlusion, which is basically how shadowed areas are, maybe increases on your clothes and things, then you can use a high poly version to bake textures that you put onto your low poly character later on. And it's also common that you might want to have multiple level of detail, so LOD objects. And you have to usually start with the low poly one, and then you create maybe a medium poly version and a high poly version. And then you can create, in the game engine, you can then select that it should change those automatically based on how far the character is from the camera itself. That's pretty much automated these days. All you have to do is create the 3 different ones and then assign the level of detail. So maybe a video on that in the future would be good too. When I model, I often go into Alt-Z here. You can see that and puts it into see-through mode, and then that makes you able to see how the geometry is in areas that are hidden, so that's really useful. You can also select parts that are behind in the character. So I toggle often to see what the character looks like with and without, but I usually don't spend the whole time in X-ray because it could be confusing as well. And now I think, did I spot the broken arm yet? Yeah, I'm like, what has happened here? And I thought this was something I did just then. Little did I know that I'd been spending like 20 minutes with a broken hand here on both sides. And I think I tried to revert it. I do Control Z 36 times thinking I'll be able to go back here because I thought I'd just messed it up. But then I go, okay, let's just fix it a different way. So I do Alt Z to see through, go 1 to get the vert select, and then I just decide to remodel this part. So I just extrude the arm again from the elbow. And here's again where I want to emphasize that you want to have those little extra lines there. See that I've got 3 lines all the way around the elbow there. And that's again for when you have an armature, like the bones inside this character, and you bend that elbow. If you didn't have it, it would get a really strange fold if you just had 1 line. So as it bends, it will create a really skinny elbow with a really strange geometry. So those extra lines, the weight painting will do it automatically, so it makes it like arc a little bit nicer, like a bent pipe. So trust me on that one. You can try it without if you want to save a few polygons, but it won't look so good. So I do the same thing here, just the palm, and same thing goes for the virtual palm here, or fingers. See those extra 3 lines around there? That's just so when you bend the fingers, I'm just going to have a hand bone and a finger bone, and when you bend that, you want to have the palm of the hand be able to arc a little bit so it doesn't just fold these really strangely. So I put a little bit extra on the thumb there as well. You could go a few more lines if you want to. It's up to you. When we do the weight painting later on, you'll be able to figure out. So that's how quick it was to recreate that broken arm. So there's no panic in the stables if that happens. That's not even a saying, but it is now panic in the stables. And I moved the necktie here a little bit inside into the body as well. It's since I wasn't going to plan to have it separate there, it doesn't really matter if it's hidden inside. But if it was to be right on top, I could risk with the weight painting that it would detach itself. Not really a problem either, but that was my thought process. And for inspiration, usually I don't really go with any reference, but I do look at a few things maybe before I model something for inspiration. So for this character, I don't think I did. I just started off modeling. And I sort of know from the Westerns that I watched in the past that he should have some sort of a hat and maybe a belt and the necktie, and the boots. That was pretty much as far as I know. But I do think maybe I looked at a cowboy hat after on, because I couldn't remember exactly what they looked like. Maybe I make it look into a pirate hat or something. For the ear here, I did the same as I did with the eyes. I just detached one of the polygons or one of the quad faces there. And then I shaped it into an ear and extruded it. So it's quite nice to be able to have that detached from the head as well for a low poly character, because then you can position it whichever way you want without having to add a lot of interior geometry that you don't need. Thing to be aware of when you do detach the ears and the eyes like that is that when you do the automatic weight painting, usually it doesn't really get weight painted correctly for if you have separate objects like the ears and the eye there. And you'll see when we weight paint this one as well that those don't get 100% weight on the head. So when you rotate the head, it'll leave the eyes and ears a little bit in place. So that has to be fixed a little bit in afterwards. But that's pretty much the only thing I think that's an issue with a detached geometry like that. And I'd say it's not really a problem that it's got faces in the back as well that are inside the head, because we don't have so many polygons. I guess if you really wanted to optimize it, you could delete those on the inside of the eye. There's a quad face that's not visible, for example. You could delete that, but usually I don't really bother. And I often get the question on the inspiration, like how do I figure out what to model or how to model it? And I've also noticed that a lot of people that watch my videos, for example, if I do a shed or something, or if I do like a little red house, or if I do a floating island, a lot of people follow that tutorial and do the exact same scene that I did. And I guess, I mean, whichever way you can learn is good. And if that's your preference to do it, if you want to copy exactly what I do, you could do. But I do encourage you as well to just try to think of the methods that I use and then come up maybe with your own topic. So if I'm doing a cowboy in this sense, you could use the same type of thing to maybe do, I don't know, you could do like a ninja or maybe a knight, or you could do I don't know what you're into, like I'd be doing like an astronaut or something. So maybe just replicate the technique and the methods and then try to do something that you have more passion for. I find that I do a better job usually if it's something I'm really interested in, if it's something, and with cowboys, I don't know, maybe I should have lived in the 1800s or something. I had a period, especially when I grew up, when I thought I was born in the wrong era. I should have been a cowboy or something. So I used to watch Pony Express with Buffalo Bill Cody as a kid, and I used to watch a lot of Western movies. I used to love North and South, which was for the American Civil War. When I was in the US, I went to Gettysburg because I studied in high school for a year, so we went to look at that. So for some reason, like cowboy-themed things, and also, what's that film called? I should know that by now. Young Guns 1 and 2, amazing. So I was convinced that I should have lived back then. I'm pretty glad that I didn't, because they didn't have Blender, I'm pretty sure, so should be happy. And I think, I don't know, if you were like creative, that struck me the other day as well. If since I like to create things, and now it happens to be games and 3D art and stuff, and I was thinking, if I did live back then, what would I like to create then? And I guess I'd be like falling into the category of becoming like a blacksmith or something to create, I don't know, weaponry or something. I don't know if there was a huge market for art, I guess there was, but I think I would have wanted to make more practical things. So, well, I get a little bit sidetracked here, I guess. What I was trying to say is with inspiration, just try to figure out something that you're interested in and apply these techniques and model your own things. So if I'm making a cowboy game here, you might want to do something totally different, like a gardening game, maybe, a canoeing simulator, a mountain bike simulator, a motocross simulator, I don't know, like a game with planes or spaceships and stuff. Just apply these techniques and do your thing, I think. But you're welcome to copy, of course, as well if you want to. I don't really mind. So whatever you find is easiest, but I do encourage that little bit of out-of-the-box thinking. So usually for inspiration, or if I do look at references, I don't try to copy it and use blueprints to make the exact same thing. I look at maybe a Google search images, and then if I were to do for this one, maybe I'll do like a search for cowboy, just to get an idea of what type of clothing they would have. And so like a hat, of course, and this black vest and like the necktie. And later on, I also I had to Google what the names of those were, because I searched for like pants on top of pants, leather pants, and I believe they're called chaps. So that's what I modeled later on as well, to get like the protective stuff in front. I don't know, I guess they use that for when they're doing horses and stuff. So I'm going to say, is there any more stuff that I can come up with why to go low poly instead of high poly? Another good thing is if you're not that good, to be honest, I get a lot of people saying that, you're a master at Blender and you're really good at modeling, and I'm pretty decent at doing low poly stuff, but I've tried high poly a few times and I'm rarely happy with my result, to be honest. So that could be another reason to go low poly. You can cover the fact that your skills might not be up to par to do the high poly stuff. Maybe that'll come in the future. So I find it quite nice that you don't have to go for full realism and spend so much time doing it. I think the time aspect is a super cool factor. Another good thing is that I guess that's true for whether it's low poly or not, but I tend to want to share my armature, so the skeleton that I create, I want to share that with loads of characters, and I guess that's perfectly valid even if you want to do high poly stuff, of course. Maybe like games like Fortnite and stuff do that all the time. They share the same armature for, I think, pretty much all their characters, because there's so much work going into the animations, especially if you want to grab onto like different props or interact with different characters. I think that's why a lot of the characters, if you play Fortnite, for example, maybe you haven't thought about it, but why aren't there any really short people or short skins in there, or why aren't there really big fat ones or ultra skinny ones, or maybe proportions with longer arms and stuff? And that's because all the work that goes into animating those characters, they'd have to create separate animations for all of this different body types. So when they introduce a new dance that every kid in the world wanted to buy, I don't know if it's popular anymore, but then they'd have to redo that dance for all those different characters. And I say that, and it's probably true to some extent, but then there's also in-game engines. I know Unity, for example, if you use a humanoid character, you can retarget animations and reuse them. I've tried that a few times, and if you have a really tall one and a really short character, it does a fairly decent job to retarget those animations. And normally, out of the box, you couldn't use it. It wouldn't work. So if you animated a character with long legs and then try to play that animation on a character with short legs, it wouldn't work at all. So the retargeting it does a really good job to save your time, but it's not perfect, I would say. When I looked at it, you could get some issues with limbs penetrating and the floor, the way it touches the floor or bends the legs. That's not optimal, but usually it's good enough. But that's one of the main reasons anyway why you want to reuse the same armature, because that'll save you a lot of animation time later on. So what I was considering for a game like this is maybe having 2 or 3 armatures. So you have maybe like a child armature, a tall character armature, and I don't know, one more alternative. And then if you model a lot of characters, then you would have to pick one of the armature that suits that character style the best, and then try to stick within those constraints of modeling your character. So, but again, I think that's true as well for whether you're going high poly or low poly, so that's not really an argument to sell you in on low poly. And another thing, as you can see now, I've decided not to cut this one too much or in fact, I'm leaving the whole process. And this is pretty much what it looks like when I model. I put a bit of music on in the background, and then I just spend a lot of times and I tweak a lot and I look at it. I rotate the object a little bit, look from different angles, try to figure out, am I happy with this? Am I not? And this is my workflow in a nutshell, I'd say, that I just sit like this and until I'm happy. And a lot of toggling then between X-ray, see-through and repairing it, and then try to avoid having polygons that are too distorted or too broken. And just refine. Look at it, refine. Look at it, refine. And if you're unhappy, maybe sometimes you have to delete something and start over. And sometimes it's more salvageable. And you can see that the head is missing now. And that's another technique I use a lot. I usually select polygons when I'm in editing mode, because everything of this is in the same character here. And you can select a bunch of faces, and then press H key, and that'll hide those polygons. And then you press Alt H to unhide it. So when I wanted to model the beard, since it's in the same actual object, but it's a separate mesh in there, I selected the head polygons there, and then I pressed H to hide it, and then I could see what the beard looked like. I could have used X-ray instead, but quite often it's nice to get those away altogether so you can work with something without X-ray on. Another thing with the hat here is still in the same object, and for props that are, for example, attached to the head like a hat or maybe a backpack on the back, one thing I really like to do is to create, well, at some point later on in the process, I'll take those polygons and I'll detach those into a separate object altogether that I name hat. And usually in a game, you don't really need to weight paint the hat or the backpack, especially, again, low poly is your friend. You don't have to worry about that too much. So if you detach it into a separate object, then you can parent, let's see now, so I say this right. You parent the hat object to your head bone in your armature in the game engine and make that hat a child object of the head bone. And it will automatically follow along. When your character bends his head or tilts it or leans it forward or back, that hat will follow along and rotate just fine and doesn't have to be weight painted. You can interchange hats then, so if you have like 10 different hats that are attached to the head bone, you could just hide and show them as you want. And that's a way to do. I do that for all the clothes in the next video. All the clothes and all the props like that are attached to the character. They're just hidden. So most of the time when you see it, maybe it's got a black hat on. It's because the white hat and the gray hat is still on the head, but they're hidden, so you can't see them. And then you can just toggle there. That's one of the things I like to do. And again, you don't really have to weight paint those. I think I end up weight painting the hat in this one, but I'm probably going to revert that later on and then just make it a solid object that's not weight painted, because it doesn't need to be weight painted at all. And another nice thing with doing it that way, if you do it as a separate object that's attached to the head bone in the game engine, is that, let's say the character gets shot or falls down and becomes a ragdoll, then you can just unparent the hat object and make that not to be apparent at all. And if it's got a rigid body and a collider, the hat will just fly off like it wasn't attached to it at any point. So that's cool if your character does like fall off a horse or fall off a cliff or something. Then, or maybe you get shot in the hat, then you can just detach it and not make it apparent anymore of the head bone. Just activate its own rigid body and have a collider on it, and it'll fly off, act really nicely. And that goes the same for any props that you might have. If he's got a revolver in his hand, that can do exactly the same. I usually do exactly the same there. Model it as a separate object in the end, and then attach it, in that case, to the hand bone instead. And then just make that the child of the hand bone. Have him run around with it, fire it, it'll follow along the animations really nicely, and then by the time he needs to drop it, then you unparent it and just activate its own rigid body and collider, and it's just going to work. And physics engine takes over, so it's really neat. Here we're modeling the hair, and I usually don't bother too much with animating the hair, or you could create like separate bones if you want to for your head rig. And maybe I'll do some optional bones in the future for this character. But most cowboys I don't think had too long of a hair, but if I do some females as well, maybe we want like a ponytail or something. And then you need to add, there's multiple ways to do it, but I think I would add a few bones or armature bones that come out from the head and then just fall back, like if you have 2 pigtails, for example, or 2 ponytail, or 1 ponytail, I guess. But the thing is that you'd have to animate those most likely. So for all the animations that you do for the character, when they're spinning around and things, you have to animate those bones as well. So I'd have to go back and add keyframes to those parts of the armature for all the animations that I did. And there's also probably a way that you could do, for hair especially, if you're going to have it in the game engine, maybe the better way to do it is just skip animating those, unless you want to have the full control, which you might need to. But you could instead have those 3 bones attached into a separate armature that is attached to the head. And then you could have maybe like 3 colliders on the head. Ooh, my phone's ringing. Let's see, I have to pause this then. Let's just take this call. Hello? Hi. All right. You're in a video now. Because I'm doing this uncut now, so I'm just recording those things. Let's see, I've got 44. Just trying to see how much I've got left. No, I've got loads of hours, but not in this episode. I've got like why can't I pan? 50. Oh yeah, I've got quite a bit. So she wants to go to sleep now, or? All right, I'll have to pause this then and come back to it. All right, I'll see you in a bit. Bye. All right, guys, so much for taking this in one sitting. I'm going to pause here and continue this conversation in just a moment, so don't go anywhere. Just, in fact, keep watching. I'm going to put my kids to sleep. Sounds weird, but I think that's the terms they use. They're going to go to sleep now, and I'll come back and record some more. So our cowboy is starting to look pretty much like a cowboy, I'd say. So even though the clothes are attached at this point, and our goal is to detach those and make them interchangeable, of course. So that's what we're going to do. And usually I also tweak my models a lot. It's difficult to know exactly when you're satisfied with the way they look. And I guess in a way you'll never be satisfied. But there's a point where it comes that it's going to be good enough. That's one of the mottos. Is that called even? Yeah, motto. It's that'll do, or that's good enough. And then move on to something else. Don't get stuck on details for too long. That's one of the good things when you do Ludum Dare. If you've never heard of that, then Ludum Dare is a game jam, and I guess any game jam will do, but Ludum Dare is what I sort of fell for, and that's where you make a game from scratch in just a weekend. Got a video in my history about that, and before I got started with that, I thought, what's the point of doing a game in a weekend that probably won't even be that good to begin with? But the fact that you push yourself through from start to finish to make a game fully playable, it's actually a really healthy exercise that I recommend anyone to do. You'll find that there is a lot of things about making a game that you don't really think about otherwise. So stuff will take a lot longer than you think, because getting a playable prototype in place can be done nowadays really fast with Unity, or even I guess if you're handy with Unreal or Godot. So the problem then is that when you've got a playable prototype, even though you think that, oh, this is pretty much a game now, just getting it finished into a game with menu states or game states altogether, maybe high scores and transitions, and if you got to add some story or maybe more levels, you'll find that there's a lot of time that goes into it that you didn't really think about in the beginning. So when you do a Ludum Dare, you sort of push through the whole process from start to finish, and it reminds you a little bit of all the components that need to go into a game. So usually I aim to have the game playable by the first day, and then the second day I just have spent all the time to finish it off. So that's another good thing with low poly stuff. You free up a lot of time to do other things, and if you want to add characters or components to your game, you could just jump into Blender and model some new characters, new props, new items maybe that you want to stick in your game. So we've come to the point now where the character is fully modeled, and sometimes I use the Rigify rig that comes with it, but I find that for low poly characters, my preference is definitely to do my own rig or my own armature. I wouldn't really classify it as a rig. And usually, like I've created here, I create a root bone at the bottom, and then I extrude 2 spine bones, and then I extrude a head bone. It's quite common that I skip the neck altogether. I find that pretty useless. So sometimes it's good, I guess, and especially if you want to use maybe other animations, but the fewer the bones, the easier I find it to animate pretty much. So I also extrude a collarbone. That one I do find a little bit useful, even though I broke mine most of the times on my motocross. Hopefully I won't do that anymore. It's all titanium nowadays. So, but the collarbone I do find pretty useful when I animate in the shoulder there. So it can offset or position or rotate your arm a little bit like you otherwise not be able to. And then I extruded the upper arm and the lower arm, and then I also have a hand bone and then a finger bone. I should actually call that palm bone, but it's called a finger in my case. And then a thumb also that's parented to the hand bone. And you can detach the bones with an offset like I did with the thumb there. All the bones don't need to be physically connected at the joints. You can actually detach them, same as this leg here. And see that the leg have to be parented though to the root bone there, so it follows the rest of the body. And then I extrude down upper leg bone, a lower leg bone, and then a foot. And usually the foot ends up a little bit diagonal like that. And I like to have it from the bottom of the lower leg to the tip of the toe. And you can rename all these bones here by just selecting them one by one and hitting F2 on your keyboard, function key 2, and then just name them. And I usually go root, spine 1, spine 2, head. And then it's really important now for the limbs that you do .L on the left side. So upper arm .L and lower arm .L, hand .L, fingers .L, thumb .L. The reason why it's important to have .L for left is that Blender comes with a symmetrize feature that it can flip the armature and create mirrored bones exactly in the opposite direction. And then it also renames them to .R for right. So that's why it's important. Keep that in mind. Make sure that you name those limbs .L at the end. Here's another important thing. I extract a bone from the knee that I clear the parent of, and I move it with G to the front. And that's going to be the inverse kinematics pole bone. And a pole bone is where the knee will point towards. I also do from the heel there, I extract the bone backwards. And it's important for these two bones to disable deform, because you don't want the character to be deformed by this bone, or these bones. And then that one I renamed to IK leg.pole, and then this one at the bottom, IK leg.target, and that's the inverse kinematic target bone. I've also got a few videos on this, so check out my history for low poly character modeling if you want to have a really step-by-step procedure to do this in detail, and why, maybe even why you do it. I can't remember how much detail I go into, but I definitely go into it enough so you'll learn how to do it. I add the inverse kinematics to the lower leg here. And inverse kinematics basically means that as your character is animated, if you lower the root bone or the pelvis, then the feet will stay anchored on the ground. And then if you grab a foot and move it, it'll animate the leg to rotate the joints necessary. And especially for the legs, inverse kinematics is really, really useful. It makes it a lot easier to animate. So you can focus on just positioning your upper body and rotate that, and then you lift and plant feet as necessary. And I probably said it about 9 times already, but let's say it a 10th. Check out my channel history and look for those low poly character modeling and rigging videos to get this in perfect detail. Here's an important thing as well. This kneecap, you want to go into object editing mode on the armature and see how I move this in a little slight bit there to get a little kneecap fold. And that's for the inverse kinematics to know when you lower the body which way it's going to fold that knee, because we want it to fold forward like a kneecap. Otherwise you'll be in serious problems if the kneecap folds backwards. So that little dint there, or little offset, will take care of that. And I also do the same here for the elbow, but in the opposite direction, of course. Because when you have that little fold or that little angle, then the inverse kinematics is kind of know then how to fold it. And here we can see that it's sort of working, but we still got some serious issues there with the legs. So usually that's due to either you've got something incorrectly configured on your inverse kinematics, or in our case, I think it's the knee, that poil joint that needs to be moved. Hello guys, I'm just jumping in from the editing suite now. I'm just editing this video, and I want to mention that I flipped the character, or I rotated it 180 degrees around the up and down axis, which is the Z axis in Blender. And the reason why I do this is because I need the character to face in the Y positive direction, so in the direction that the green arrow is pointing in Blender. And the reason for that is that since the Unity 2020 came along, they've included a little bake axis conversion feature that will manage to convert from the Blender axis system to the Unity axis system, since they're using different coordinate system for some weird reason. I recommend that you model them so they're facing in the positive Y direction down along the green arrow in the Blender axis. Control Tab is the key that you use to move in and out of pose mode, and it'll be a little bit confusing in the beginning, like when should you be in pose mode and stuff, and when you animate everything is in pose mode, and also when you set up the inverse kinematics, that's in pose mode. And if you need to edit the bones, the armature, then you do that in edit mode. So you're going to be pressing Control Tab a lot, and you can see when the bones are light cyan or blue colored, that means that you're in pose mode. I also modified the mesh a little bit there, so that knee cap angle is accommodated for, and same thing here for the elbow. For the arms, I won't really use inverse kinematics. I usually animate those in forward kinematics. And sometimes it would be really handy to have the hands, especially when you're doing weapons, to have forward or inverse kinematics. But the problem is that it's quite tricky still in Blender, unfortunately, to switch between forward and inverse kinematics. There's a lot of stuff. I've looked for a really sleek and nice way to do it, but I haven't found one. So you have to set up duplicate bone structures that copies and pastes like the angles of all the bones for the arms. And I'm still waiting for a significant improvement on IK switching. So for now, I tend to animate all my motions with forward kinematics for the arms. And for low poly, I find that to be perfectly fine usually. It'll be good enough. So you can see that the leg was folding really strange there, so I end up moving the pole target for the knees. And now when we press Control Tab and go back in here, then you can see that that weird flip of the leg wasn't a problem anymore, apart from maybe if you go straight forward. But when you animate, you can animate those pole bones as well, so the knees are pointing in the right direction. We'll get into the animation a lot where you knock the character over, or if he's gonna face plant onto the ground and stuff, you have to get those pole target bones straight under him, under the ground. Another thing we do here, that again, for the 12th time I'm saying it, check out my other character modeling and rigging videos. But I disable the inherent rotation for the foot bone, and then I make it instead copy the rotation of this IK target bone on the heel. Because when you animate, that's the target bone there is the one that you're going to be using when you place your feet. So I want to have the rotation also copied from that bone, so I can use that not only to move the foot, but also to rotate the foot. And it's important here that you change a few things when you do this. When you set the copy rotation, you have to do it first of all in this inverse kinematic, or in the, I can't even see, in this tab, the little green character tab, I forget what it's called. That's the one that you have to copy rotation constraints. And then I pick the armature, and it's going to copy the rotation of this target bone here. And you can't pick that with a little picker for some reason. You have to search for it or pick it manually. And then that won't work straight out. You need to change into local space for the target and for the owner as well. And you'll see now when I rotate it around the Z axis or the up and down axis, then the rotation was incorrect. So you have to invert a couple of the axes here. And I usually get those wrong all the time, so I have to do this. Even though I've done it like a billion times, I tend to pick the wrong ones. So you have to go back and make sure that you invert. In this case, I think I invert the Z axis. That looks good, yeah. So when I rotate, it's because the bones are pointing in different directions there. That's why the Z rotation needs to be inverted. But then when you roll the foot now, everything like that looked okay, but when you roll the foot here, you can see that it's rolling in the incorrect direction. So I also have to flip the Y axis there. And now when you roll the black bone, then the rotation of the foot is correct too. And it's also important to do this while you still have not mirrored your character, because when you do the symmetry mod, like operation now, you want to make sure that you don't have to redo all the inverse kinematics as well. So that's why I make sure all of this is working. That's not really a problem when you go back like that. We can live with that. So again, you can animate the movement of those pull targets so you don't get those weird flips. Okay, now in edit mode, I just press F3 and I search for the symmetry. I don't think it's a modifier, it's an operation that you do. And that flipped the whole armature there and everything is good to go. And I just renamed it Cowboy Armature, and the mesh itself I renamed to Cowboy finally. Changed the name. And then you select the mesh, shift select the armature and do Control P and do set parent, and you do with automatic weights. And nowadays the Blender does a really good job. Blender does a really good job. So it really weight paints everything pretty good. And there's not that many tweaks that you need to do. And usually even the hand there is good enough. You could spend forever probably to tweak the weight painting. I usually don't bother too much with it because the animations are going to be really fast and rapid, and in the game you won't really tell. So instead of wasting precious time on tweaking this forever, just spend that time maybe doing other stuff, like making the game. It's looking pretty good. When you rotate the characters here, I usually go through. Here we see a problem with the vest. And here's why we're going to fix this in the second video of modeling all the clothes again. I end up modeling that vest once again because it's better to copy the upper chest now that we have weight painted the character again. Because this is the result of the automatic weight painting when I did this after I modeled it. And this is why I don't really recommend modeling the detached clothes like the vest or even that necktie. I think it's better to weight paint or do this armature like with automatic weights before, and then you model all the clothes. So that was a lesson learned even for me, that I've been doing this for many years now to create characters. This was an epiphany. I was really happy when I realized that, okay, let's just get rid of that vest later on and then remodel it. And I ended up making quite a lot of different sets of clothes, different pants, different tops, t-shirts, shirts, and different vests and those chaps for the pants. Because here you can see in the weight paint that the body there has got a lot of green and yellow, but the vest itself didn't. So the weight painting works really good for connected geometry, but it does not play well with detached geometry, which is the same case for this vest and also the necktie and the eyes. So for the eyes and the hair and anything that's attached to the head, it's not really much of a problem because there's a quick way to just reassign everything to get 100% weight to the head bone. But for the body, there's so many different types of weights onto those, and it'd be really painstaking, or it'd suck basically to do all that manually and try to copy those. And that's why we're going to scrap this whole vest and redo it from scratch. I spent quite a long time here when I was doing it, and like I said, I've decided to keep this in real time so you can see the way I think as well, because I usually sit like this and I rotate it, and in this case I selected individual verts, and I saw that the weight paint there was how much it was attached. You can see on the right side there on the numbers panels, you can see that the spine has got the majority, and I was thinking, how should I copy the verts there like this? Because you can copy the weights across. And I was thinking, is that going to give a good enough result? So instead of searching for a solution, I usually think about the problem a little bit first. And I try a few things to see if that solves it. And that's exactly what I sat and did here. Picked a few verts, picked the verts on the body, which the last vert that you select will be the active vert or vertex. And then when you click that copy, it'll copy the weight across. So I was thinking, is this going to be a viable way to get through this? Am I going to be able to get this vest to follow this properly? And I could probably get it to a good enough result, but imagine if you made loads of clothes. That would be really problematic. You can see that it was better. I mean, it didn't fold the bottom ones, but I still had problems with the upper verts. So as I was doing this, contorting it, and then I started to think, is that going to be a problem? Are you going to animate the upper bone that much to the point where it's going to actually break through like that? So my mind was going into those type of things, like, okay, will I get away with it? That's one thing that's quite healthy to ask yourself, because if something isn't perfect, maybe it doesn't need to be perfect either. Can you avoid it maybe some other way? And sometimes it's a good solution to do it that way, and sometimes it's a really terrible way to do it. But you have to analyze every problem that you run into. And here I thought, okay, what if I just move those verts out a little bit? Am I going to avoid the problem by moving the vertices out? And I could probably do that as well. So it's all a thought process. It's like troubleshooting on the fly. And you're never going to get it right the first time, probably. And you learn things as you go. So again, I did the same type of thing up here. I selected those vest vertices on the outside, and then I shift selected the body vert last, so that became the active, and then I copied it. And then I have Alt-Z here so I can see through. It's important to have Alt-Z, which is the see-through or X-ray operation, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to see and pick the weights from those verts. And now when I folded it, yeah, it worked pretty good. So this might not be the wrong way to do it. It's just that I found a better way to do it again than was to copy the whole upper body instead and attach that into a new geometry, because that brings across all the vertex, or all the vertex weight just comes along as a nice bonus. Then you don't have to sit and do that manually. For the belt, I didn't really want that to bend, so I was thinking about solutions for that as well. And I copied, I had some problems first of all that it didn't follow the way I did, so I did the same thing there. I pressed L when I hovered over the belt buckle, and L selects all the linked vertices, and then I just copied the vertex paint there from the belt one that is attached to the body, and that looked better. So it's a matter of getting it to good enough, I think. Again, try to not over obsess about these things. Just try to get it to a point where you get away with it. Here I think I spotted as well that he's got no, he's got his pantsless. So I had to go in here and correct that. So I Control Tab out of post mode, and then I go select the armature, or not the armature, the mesh instead, pick that bottom face, and then just reassign the UV space there. I should mention that for the UV mapping, especially for the Unreal Engine, there's a problem if you shrink the UVs to an infinite small point. I think it's a problem in the Unreal Engine, especially not so much for characters, I think, because those UV islands are usually used for shadow mapping as well, so for more performant non-real-time shadows. And then you'd probably need to have a second set of UV coordinates that are spread across, so all the body parts are spread across the entire UV space, so across all this texture. I've not run into a problem with it in Unity because, first of all, I don't really, on characters, I try to, since everything is low poly, I use real-time shadows most of the time, and that's not really a problem. You don't need the UV mapping to have 100% coverage across the whole UV space or the whole image. And even if I did, Unity's got a little tick box to generate shadow map coordinates or shadow map UVs in the second channel. So that's a tick box when you import an object. So for characters, again, I don't think it's a problem because you couldn't shadow map those anyway. They're moving all the time, and you couldn't like render a shadow map for a character because it's going to be moving and animating. But it would be a problem maybe when we get into the environment modeling later on, where we do all the buildings and cactuses and boxes and I don't know, the gallows and things. Then those are probably going to be fixed in the scene all the time, or most parts of them anyway. So those you probably want to do, if you're doing for Unreal Engine, make sure that you do a second UV channel that you spread out and do automatic unwrapping of all the UV coordinates. So the entire object is spread out over an entire UV space. So from 0 to 1 in both U and V directions, which is basically X and Y. So a little side note there. Could be good to know. So but for Unity, I tend to care very little about that problem. For low poly games, I just do one UV channel and I map it with the infinite small points for the vertices here, so I just get a color from this texture. The good thing with using textures like this is that you could actually create separate textures that you name the different regions in. So you could have one for skin tones, one for hair colors and different colors. And then you could create different textures, and with the same character you could just drag and drop in different textures. And it'll swap out, for example, all the the shirt colors or all the hair colors or all the skin colors. So, but I should also mention the benefit of using the same texture for all characters and all objects is that Unity will do automatic batching a lot of the time. Maybe not so much for the animated objects, unfortunately. So the characters, you're pretty much left without the performance improvement. But if you use the same texture and same material, which is very important, on loads of different objects, so I use this material, same one for all my buildings and everything, then Unity can automatically batch those and render them in the same draw call. So try to use the same material on as many objects as you can. And I think it works really good when you got a palette like this to for the low poly, is that pretty much every object near enough can, in your whole game, could use the same material. Minus transparent and emitting objects, of course. They'll be a bit different. So I go in also here, and I think I do that same type of fix here for the necktie. I think there's a better name than a necktie, isn't it? But here I remove the weight painting altogether. With Control G, you can remove all the vert weights. And then you can do Control G again and set the active bone, and then you can assign 100% of the weight to those. And as you can see, I totally messed that up. So that didn't really work so well. So when I press L now again to select the linked vertices here, press Control G, I removed all of them, all the weight paints, and then I set the active bone to spine 2. And then I did Control G again and assigned it to active group. And then I went back into pose mode here. And then when we test it, then we can see that the verts there for the necktie follow the pretty good there. They could be 100% mapped, as far as I know now, to that upper spine bone or spine 2 bone. There was a problem with the vest that we're going to fix later on by creating a whole new vest altogether. So let me know in the comments what you think, and subscribe if you haven't already, and give the video a thumbs up if you thought it was helpful. And finally, I've also got a Patreon. If you go to Imphenzia.com, that's also a site that you should visit. But if you go to patreon.com/Imphenzia, you can give a little bit of extra support there and help me make these videos in the future. So until next episode and until next video, take care, and I'll see you then. Bye for now.